Hello and welcome to another episode. We're going to take a look at TrackMania 2 Valley. TrackMania 2 is actually more like a collection of 4 different games combined. TrackMania 2 Canyon, Stadium, Valley, and Lagoon. Now you can buy each of these portions of TrackMania 2 separately. In fact, that's the normal way of purchasing TrackMania 2. However, TrackMania 2 Valley in particular, I think, is the best one. Now, TrackMania Turbo is a consoleized version of TrackMania 2. I'm building in TrackMania Turbo first because it's easier to port it into TrackMania 2. But they made the controls for the track builder simplified, even though I do think that they could have improved on it a lot more, because unfortunately they dumbed it down so much to the point where building tracks are not actually, it's no longer a powerful tool, the track editor in Turbo. However, fortunately in the PC version of Turbo, since Turbo really is actually just a modified TrackMania 2, it actually has a lot of TrackMania 2's underlying code, meaning that they also offer the TrackMania 2 level editor, which is the thing that saves Turbo, in my opinion, because now I can actually build Turbo maps that are just as elaborate as any PC port of TrackMania that I'm familiar with. And here I am building the stadium because I thought it would be a cool idea to actually have the map start in the stadium, and you drive out of the stadium and go on dirt roads and ride on farms and stuff, and then you come back to the stadium. Now, I didn't actually plan for that at this point. I originally was only going to have the stadium be the starting point, but then I thought, it would actually make more sense if you had to go back to the stadium. Even though clearly there isn't a crowd, it's still a stadium. The seats are empty. In fact, the seats are currently occupied by these light up signs. Now, I wanted to make the stadium twice as higher because I felt that it was maybe a little too small. But then I realized that you can't actually just take the bottom half or the bottom part of the stadium and just duplicate it on top, because the stadium actually has all of these, especially around the corners, the curved corners. There's like concrete floors that are going to be floating above you, and it just looks ridiculous. So I tried to come up with another solution, and I came up with this square method, or this rectangle over a circle, and it actually still looks like a stadium. It still looks pretty cool, and it does work. Of course, I would spend a very long time refining the look, trying to get it to fit in a very convincing manner and not have it look weird. But fortunately, this is a time-lapse video, so we're not going to sit through me spending like 20 minutes just thinking about how to get the stadium to work. It can become quite difficult when you're trying to do something that the game was never designed to do. You can only have one row of these stadium blocks. And here I am trying to bend what the game is actually capable of. But nothing seems to be working until eventually I decided to stop recording, figure it out, and then I was like, okay, I think I have a design that I'm happy with, and then I continued recording. So don't worry, we're not going to spend that much time on the stadium here. In fact, I'm going to do some skips occasionally throughout this time lapse. So TrackMania Turbo originally was actually more advanced because it was a more recent version of TrackMania 2, so to speak. But because it wasn't nearly as successful as the PC exclusive TrackMania 2, it just kind of went underutilized, and eventually all of the new updates that were applied to TrackMania 2 would not be applied to Turbo. And as a result, there are a handful of features that especially the Valley environment has in TrackMania 2 that Turbo doesn't have. Now, because of this, it's actually better to build the map first in Turbo, because you can actually port the map over to TrackMania 2. And the reason why you do it like that is because if you had older versions of TrackMania, like TrackMania Nations as an example, it was very easy to port a Nations map into Turbo. But with Valley, it was harder because the game was actually never really intended to allow you to import maps from other versions of TrackMania, simply because it really is just it's a carryover from the code in TrackMania 2. It wasn't really kept in because it was going to be a very commonly used feature in TrackMania Turbo. It was just a leftover from TrackMania 2. But I'm glad that it technically still works, that you can import a map, unofficially in Turbo, because that means I don't have to rebuild maps, especially when it comes to maps that I really like, that I want to be able to play or share with people. And not everyone has Turbo, so or not everyone has TrackMania 2, or not everyone has TrackMania United. So it's nice to have a map that I can just easily port from one game to the other. The other reason why I started building in Turbo, again, TrackMania 2 has received a bunch of updates, and as a result, Turbo will just crash if you try to load a TrackMania 2 map. Fortunately, TrackMania 2, unlike Turbo, is designed specifically to be compatible with other games in the TrackMania franchise that use the same environments, the same blocks and stuff. But what's neat about TrackMania 2 is that when I built a map in something like Turbo, and if the map includes one of those blocks that TrackMania 2 doesn't have, then instead of crashing like with Turbo, TrackMania 2 will actually tell me, we cannot load this map because we don't have this block and that block. And they name them in a very intuitive way, so you kind of can figure out which blocks it is that you have to remove. There are some unique blocks that Turbo has that TrackMania 2 doesn't, but it's more for aesthetic things, not really a track thing. Like, for instance, the helicopter and the big crane that's holding up the podium. Those are not in TrackMania 2, so I deleted that. But there was also a certain, I think it was a certain sign or tunnel or something like that that I couldn't use. So after I deleted them and replaced it with a different one, then it was able to load in TrackMania 2 no problem. Now, TrackMania Turbo has that sort of like fun, fair, party industrial style to it. So it has a very like 90s feel to it, a lot of uses of blue and yellow color theme, and it's it's a style I actually really like, and I wish that they kind of would include that in TrackMania 2, but I suppose TrackMania 2 has a different style, different aesthetic that they want to maintain for consistency purposes, and also to give people a reason to want to play TrackMania Turbo in the first place. It's actually much easier porting stuff into TrackMania 2 than porting stuff into Turbo. In fact, Turbo, because it's not meant to do that initially, you have to take a very roundabout approach. You have to trick the game into thinking that it's loading the Turbo map when in reality it's not loading the Turbo map. But a lot of the time it does work, especially if the game is older than TrackMania Turbo. Like, for instance, on the internet, there's an old version of TrackMania Canyon floating around, which is pretty much the original from 2011. I found out about the old version through Accursed Farms, where Ross, he pointed out that there are actually differences between the old version and the new version, other than just that the new version has more features, but that there's some graphical differences or artistic differences between older versions of TrackMania 2 and newer versions of TrackMania 2. And the thing is that they're not all better. The new version isn't entirely better over TrackMania 2 from back in the early 2010s. Like, for instance, the shadows are less elaborate for whatever reason.
We have these bright spotlights and it seems to have no impact at all. So now let's compare this to the old version. Oh, look at that. We have multiple fading shadows from every light source behaving exactly as you'd expect.
And so as a result, I would seek out this old version of Canyon. And, I do play Canyon legally. I've got Canyon on TrackMania 2 from Nadeo, but it's nice to have the old version to see the differences. And there are some things I actually do prefer in the old version. For starters, it has split screen mode. And yes, they actually removed that in a later update of TrackMania 2. I think it was around 2017 when they removed it, which is really upsetting, I have to admit. So as a result, we try to maintain and back up these things as best as we can, because Nadeo not only has removed features in the past of some of their older games, it's not just that they did it once or twice, it's just that the fact that they've done it at all means that nothing's going to stop them from doing it again. And that's very, very frustrating. It's anti-consumer. It's really, really, really does suck. So anyways, so I still have an old version of Canyon. Unfortunately, there is no old version of Valley that at least has been cracked. So I'm stuck with the current updated version, which, it's got some of the new blocks that Turbo doesn't have. The older version of Valley doesn't either. But TrackMania 2 Valley in its original form also had some of those features that the new one doesn't have, like split screen mode as an example. And it's really, it's very upsetting. So I'm hoping someday someone somewhere in the world will be able to crack that version so that we can keep that on our computers just whenever we feel like playing split screen mode in TrackMania 2, because I still play these games with my family, particularly with my nephews. So yeah, with Canyon, the old version of Canyon, you have to first build the map in Canyon and then port it over to Turbo, because Turbo came out in 2016, so it's newer. But nowadays, I think overall TrackMania 2 as a whole has more features ultimately than Turbo does. So it's really unfortunate that Turbo didn't work out. But the reality is that Turbo was too difficult to control, and so casual players couldn't really get into it. And it's ironic that I feel I'm pretty sure that the developers probably don't realize how difficult Turbo actually is to play, how difficult the cars are to handle, or how much more challenging the maps actually are, even though they were producing Turbo with the intent to cater to casual console players. So they didn't really succeed in that regard. However, you can't really blame Turbo completely, because Turbo really is just a consoleized version of TrackMania 2. And I would argue that the problems, or at least the cracks to the problems, started with TrackMania 2 Canyon. That car actually is kind of difficult to control because it's a very sluggish, laggy car, meaning that it takes about a quarter of a second for the car to react to your controls. So because it's such a heavy, sluggish car, you have to have a lot of predictive capabilities when you play TrackMania Canyon. And you also have to have really amazing reflexes and reaction times, which I don't actually really possess, to be honest. I play a lot of video games, but there are certain biological things that I can never get rid of, and that is my very sluggish reaction times. People say that just by practicing you can lower your reaction time, and that is true to a certain extent. But if you play video games as your primary form of entertainment, and your reaction time is still 0.3 of a second on a good day and 0.4 on a bad day, which is my score, by the way, I do feel like I'm at a disadvantage. And the last thing I want is for the game to add additional lag that my brain is already causing. So Canyon is difficult to control. Also, the Canyon car does things that at first doesn't make sense. The Canyon car is almost as complex as a real car, which kind of defeats the whole point of an arcade racer like TrackMania. But again, I feel like the developers have been playing so much TrackMania that the older cars from like the first generation of TrackMania games are probably not challenging anymore for them to drive. And they were like, hey, let's make the cars feel more realistic. I mean, they're not realistic. They're still very arcadey, but they're arcadey in the wrong way. They're not intuitive. And the Canyon car was not the worst, but it was the beginnings of this problem. Now, TrackMania Valley is the same in that the car is very stiff on the road and extremely loose on dirt, meaning that it's hypersensitive on dirt, and you have to keep your thumb on the analog stick so steady. In fact, the car is so difficult to control on dirt that it is one of the first TrackMania games ever that I would say you cannot play with a keyboard. Usually TrackMania does a very good job catering to keyboard players to the point where there are even speedrunners that are still using keyboard, particularly with stuff like United and Nations. But this is not the case with Valley Car. So then why would I recommend Valley over Canyon? Well, fortunately, Valley doesn't have that lagginess to it, and the tracks are actually easier than like the turbo tracks as an example. And because of this, it actually is more approachable for your average player. And I would actually recommend TrackMania 2 Valley if you're not this die-hard fan of TrackMania. And I think that Valley is going to make it much easier for people to get into TrackMania, simply because that it is ultimately easier to control, assuming you have a controller. However, there is this controller tool. In fact, I'll put it in the description below. This tool has a sensitivity slider, and if you change it by 10%, for some reason increasing the slider actually reduces sensitivity, which is interesting. But if you increase it just by 10%, in fact, I would argue going to 20 or higher is too much. Just 10%, and it actually makes the car a lot more manageable on dirt roads, and you still have the full driving range or turn radius on tarmac as you would without using this tool. So I'm going to put this tool in the description below, so that if you guys are interested, you can check it out. It actually did make Valley far easier to control than any other TrackMania game outside of the first generation of TrackMania games. TrackMania 1 or TrackMania United and Nations and Sunrise and all of those other games that form part of the first generation of TrackMania games had very straightforward physics, very straightforward controls, whereas there's too much needless complexity to TrackMania 2 cars. And TrackMania Turbo, which caters more towards casuals, it carried over a lot of the same baggage, and this is why it didn't work, because TrackMania 2 is designed for, not intentionally designed for only hardcore players, but hardcore players are able to adapt to the difficulty of TrackMania 2. And it seems like that with every new game, the cars get harder and harder to control, to the point where eventually the latest environment, TrackMania 2 Lagoon, has a car that is, just lack for a better word, impossible to control. So much so, in fact, that even the diehard fans of TrackMania don't really like the car all that much. And the sad thing is that Nadeo, they could have avoided this. You know, they could have avoided this backlash of the Lagoon car if only they listened to the criticisms that people had for the Lagoon car in Turbo, because Lagoon had been so long in development, and to be fair, a lot of that had to do with how some of development time went to building Turbo. But Turbo didn't actually use that many resources from the developers, because again, it was just a consoleized version of TrackMania 2. But still, Valley was delayed a little bit, which is probably why they ported Nations over to TrackMania 2 to sort of add an extra environment without doing much work. And then Lagoon was supposed to come out shortly after, but instead Lagoon came out almost 4 years after. That's a very, very long time. And even with development of Turbo was supposed to come out in 2015, just over a year after Valley was released. But even that was delayed to the following year, to 2016. And then finally they were able to continue to work on Lagoon. So the first environment in TrackMania 2 came out in 2011, and the last environment came out 6 years later. So yeah, but that being said, they were developing the Lagoon environment while they were developing TrackMania Turbo, so they decided to also include what they have built so far for the Lagoon environment and to have it included in TrackMania Turbo. So Turbo was the first game to introduce the Lagoon environment. Unfortunately, the car was very unwieldy, very difficult to control, and to the point where, like, I just kind of gave up. I just couldn't wrap my head around this car. And I would spend hours and hours and hours trying to understand the blooming thing, and I just simply couldn't. It was just too difficult to control. Eventually, there would be a lot of people that would say that they don't like the Lagoon car. I wasn't the only one. There was tons of people. A lot of reviewers would mention the Lagoon car was very unwieldy, but they usually would just give them the benefit of the doubt and just assume that maybe it's just because I'm not used to it. But it turns out that as time goes by and we practice and practice, it turns out hardly any of us actually gets used to the Lagoon car. I think the only people that actually can really play the Lagoon car properly are people that spend a ridiculous amount of time playing TrackMania, like your average speedrunner, for instance. People that have the time to really dig deep and to really understand the physics of the game. But as for us normal gamers, it was just too much for us to handle. So and Nadeo, they should have learned from that. They should have been like, okay, we need to tone down the Lagoon car for when we release the full version of Lagoon for TrackMania 2. But no, instead they doubled down. They're very stubborn. They decided to have the car be exactly the same. And as a result, Lagoon is, I think, to be honest, the least successful TrackMania 2 game ever made. And because it wasn't a very successful installment in TrackMania, Ubisoft basically forced the company, or maybe the company chose to do this, I don't know, but Ubisoft basically forced the company to take a free-to-play model approach. I mean, yes, you could play TrackMania 2 online for free under certain circumstances, assuming that there was a server at the time that just happened to be running that allowed you to play that environment for free. But they wanted something that was from the ground up designed as a free-to-play model. And I never really liked this approach, especially since the monetization is actually quite horrendous. Not only it's incredibly complicated, like there's like 1,000 tiers of different kind of features you get with different purchases, which is just insane. But also, you don't even keep the stuff forever. You have to pay the game annually. So you never actually own anything. And so that's kind of like the breaking point for casual players. I don't think any casual player really... I think at that point, Ubisoft just kind of gave up on the casual players, and now they've created what I like to call a whale game, meaning that a game that is designed for diehard fans that will spend an enormous amount of money to get all of the features and to pay for it every year over and over and over again. And that's how the free-to-play model works. It's not that a lot of people spend money on free-to-play games. It's that a handful of people spend a lot of money on the game. And unfortunately, TrackMania, that started off very promising with Nations and United. Even as far back as TrackMania, I think it's called TrackMania Original Power Up. Now, Original is an updated version of the very first TrackMania game ever made. And Power Up actually truly did show us the potential, because the original TrackMania, like the very first TrackMania game, was just way too simple to be like really engaging. But after the update, after the expansion, did the same for Sunrise. Now Sunrise was already a very good game right from the start, but it became even better with the update, with the expansion, which is called Sunrise Extreme, I believe. And all of these things would be ported over to United, and the Nations environment included. And they decided eventually to have Nations be a truly free-to-play game, meaning that you absolutely did not need to pay for anything. You'll just get the whole stadium environment in its entirety. And it was great as an advertisement to get people into TrackMania. This is why Canyon actually was a pretty successful game, because it was riding on the success of United and Nations Forever. Unfortunately, I think that as people got into Canyon and discovered, how more challenging Canyon actually is, only diehard fans of TrackMania now play Canyon. I don't think a lot of casual people play Canyon. And it's a real shame, because by the time Valley came out, I think that Valley had the potential to really appeal to casuals. I even got my brother-in-law to purchase a CD keys special of Valley, and for his nephews to play. And I can already tell that they're having a much easier time playing that game than they did with Turbo and whatnot. That being said, the Valley environment in Turbo is also pretty good, pretty easy to control. Very similar to how the car controls in TrackMania 2 Valley, but that's just 1/4 of TrackMania Turbo. So Turbo was never going to succeed unless they completely overhauled the physics of the Canyon car and the Lagoon car. Now, make no mistake, the Canyon car is still manageable for your average gamer. It's just that I find the Valley car to be less frustrating. But the Lagoon car is so terrible that in and of itself would make me say to people, don't even try, don't even bother with TrackMania 2 Lagoon. And it's sort of a maybe when it comes to recommending TrackMania Turbo, because at least Turbo has Valley, it has Stadium, and an improved version of Canyon. In fact, I would recommend Turbo's version of Canyon over TrackMania 2's version, simply because they made the car more responsive. Remember how I said that the car was sluggish, it had a delay in its controls? Well, they got rid of that completely. It is now just as responsive as the Valley car. I still think the Valley car is easier to control because, again, they're trying to make the Lagoon car and the Canyon car kind of feel like they're realistic, like they have complicated physics to them, but it's not realistic. So if you have a sort of a sim racer mindset going into TrackMania Turbo, you're still going to have a bad time, because you're constantly fighting muscle memory, or you're constantly fighting your instinct as to how you're supposed to drive a real car in a racing sim like in Project Cars or Forza or Gran Turismo or something like that. The cars really are just complicated for the sake of complexity, which again is not really a problem that the Valley car and the thank goodness the Stadium car is the same car that it was in TrackMania Nations and United, which is great. I'm glad they didn't change it. And this is part of the reason why it is the most popular environment, why TrackMania 2 Stadium, I think, is still the most successful of the TrackMania 2 environments. That being said, I still recommend Turbo if you want to play Valley, Canyon, and Stadium. You can ignore Lagoon, because you can still build maps. You can still do all the usual stuff in the game that you can, even if you ignore Lagoon, and that's fine. But in TrackMania 2, like, don't spend money on it. It actually is a pretty horrible experience, that car. So at this point, I'm just repeating myself. Anyways, so the design I'm trying to aim for when it comes to building this map is that I want it to feel like a real environment. TrackMania is known for having these ridiculous, unrealistic maps, And, that's part of the appeal. There's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to create a map that not only is exhilarating and kind of over the top, but I also wanted it to give the sense of that this place could actually really exist in real life. And this is why I spend so much time just focusing on just little parts of the map. As you can see, I place an object and it doesn't look right, so I remove it and I place a different object, and then I rearrange the trees and rearrange the roads and all of this stuff. Like, normally I actually don't build maps like this. This is actually the slowest I've ever built a map, which is why we're doing a time lapse. And this is a really fast time lapse. It's instead of 400% speed, it's 600% the speed, because this video would be much longer than an hour if I were to do it 400%.